You set foot on foreign soil. Only this land isn't ruled by any country or government. In this land we celebrate music. In this land we celebrate games. In this land we celebrate those who compose video game music. Welcome to the VGMbassy. Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the VGMbassy. This is a show centered around video game music and the amazing online community of fans and podcasters that enjoy it. My name's Ed, and on each episode I'll take the role of Prime VGM Minister and invite a guest VG Ambassador onto the show to share with us their own video game music culture. Or I may share a part of my culture on a solo show. Today being one of those solo shows. We just had an amazing episode last month with my dear friend Justin Schneider talking about cool, industrial, and goth tunes in video games. All the music we featured in the show was fairly modern. It was all from either, CD audio, streaming audio, real live instrumentation, etc., etc. So I wanted to go back and get a little retro for a little while. I got inspired by some music I was listening to on YouTube at work to explore some of the more obscure Amiga titles and find some great music from them and share them with you guys. And I found a good batch of them, I think, that are a lot of fun to listen to. And I don't think the Amiga gets enough love on video game music podcasts. Game music podcasts tend to be kind of a North American-centric, I would say. There are some out of Canada as well, but there aren't a lot out of the European countries where the Amiga was particularly popular. So I think a lot of the US podcasters just don't have that familiarity. I've always had a soft spot for the Amiga. Even when I was in my teens, I stumbled across some pages that were dedicated to the Amiga, and I really kind of fell in love with the graphics and what the games could do, and that they just felt like they were really made with love. And I still get that feeling today, and especially with a lot of this music as well. The system was, equal parts commercial and hobbyist, and so there are lots and lots of games out there that are extremely AAA quality, but there are a lot of games out there that are, I guess you would call them indie titles nowadays, but still made with that same love that the indie titles are made with today. I tried to stay away from composers on this show that everybody knows. Everybody knows, Euro and Tell. Everybody knows Matt Furness. Everybody knows Drax from my previous show featuring mainly his music. So we're going to talk about some composers that I haven't featured on the VGMbassy yet. Some you might be familiar with, some you might not, but I think all of them will have really, really interesting music to listen to. So before we get into the music, a quick refresher on the Paula chip, which was the chip that was responsible for creating music in the Amiga. So Paula controlled the audio playback, the floppy disk drive, the serial port input-output, and the mouse and joystick buttons for the Amiga. It was designed by a man named Glenn Keller, and Paula is actually an acronym which stands for Ports, Audio, UART, and Logic, and coincidentally was also the chip designer's girlfriend at the time, which I thought was really funny. UART is an acronym in and of itself for Universal Asynchronous Receiver/Transmitter, which is basically a protocol by which two microchips in a computer might talk to each other. So now you know, do with that information what you will. Anyways, the cool thing about the Paula is that it was the first chip to kind of operate independently as a music source, where all the other sound sources on previous computers required constant intervention from the main CPU to output sound. It required very, very minimal attention on the Amiga. So the CPU would basically say, hey Paula, these are the tracks you're going to play, go ahead and handle it, and the Paula would just do it. And it freed up a lot of CPU time for the Amiga, which allowed it to be a much faster computer in its own right, even though it was using processors that were similar to the Macs of its day, etc. It had 4 channels of sample-based audio, so I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the Super Nintendo and its sound. It's very similar to the Super Nintendo, except it's got half the channels. So where the SNES had 8, Amiga has 4, and of course the sample rates are a little bit different, and the way it handles the samples is a little bit different, which you'll hear in the sound. It doesn't sound nearly as crisp and rich as some of the SNES tunes do. But the sound players between the SNES and the Amiga are so similar that tools have been made to take Amiga audio and convert it into SNES tunes. And there are several SNES demos out there that use converted Amiga files, and they sound almost identical to the original, which I thought was really, really cool. Most Amiga tunes are in what they call a mod format. Composers make music by entering values onto a grid. One value for the pitch of the note, and then another value for an effect, volume, reverb, attack, decay, etc., etc. So composing the music wasn't just as simple as, hitting record and playing on a piano. There was some programming involved. Keep that in mind while you listen to a lot of these tunes. I think you'll be very impressed with some of the solos and complex beats and stuff that we're going to be hearing, considering they were all kind of input manually, as was kind of the norm for chip-based music back in the day. All right, so the first game we're going to hear from is called The Curse of Ra. This is an Egyptian-themed puzzle game. This was released on the Amiga in 1991, developed by Cyberstyle and published by Rainbow Arts. The composer is one of the more well-known Amiga composers. You might recognize the name Rudolph Stember if you've listened to Pixelated Audio or a couple of other shows where they have shared Amiga music. And we're going to listen to the title screen from The Curse of Ra. So we'll be right back. Alright, that was the title screen theme from The Curse of Ra, released on the Amiga in 1991, composed by Rudolph Stember. I like this tune. I think it feels kind of like something you might hear on the SNES, and those drums just really make the tune. It feels, kind of marchy, maybe a little bit medieval until those drums kick in, and then that violin line becomes like part of the bass line. It's got kind of like an 80s synthwave feel to it a little bit when the drums kick in. Given that this was a very early 90s game, it makes sense that, they have that kind of influence for sure. It's got some really kind of staccato, heavy notes. I think they're just a lot of fun to listen to. Oh, the other thing about the Paula is that on the hardware itself, of those 4 channels, 2 were hard-panned left and 2 were hard-panned right. So if you're listening to the Amiga on headphones, it can get kind of disconcerting because you've only got instruments either on your left ear or on your right ear. If you're listening to it with speakers that are in front of you a couple feet, the sound kind of blends together before it gets to your ears. So the nice thing about modern Amiga sound players is that you can kind of mix together the stereo without making it completely mono. So I'm going to try to do that with as many of these tunes as possible. Different composers use different sound drivers for their tunes, and so those sound files end up being in slightly different formats inside the games themselves. Some formats are really easily played by, probably I guess what's the most popular mod player out nowadays is called OpenMPT, but other ones need to be played in specific players that are either written specifically for that particular sound driver or another multifaceted player like XM player or Deli player or something like that. And sometimes you don't have as much freedom to mix your audio as well. So that might explain some differences in quality as we listen to music throughout this show. The game is cool. It's a puzzle game. Again, it's got a Egyptian theme. What happens is you get a screen full of blocks, and they're usually hieroglyphs. You'll have, a face and some wavy lines and a pyramid, etc., etc. And you control a scarab, and there's a gray square with an ankh in the middle of it. There's only one of those, and there's 2 of all of the other blocks. And you need to move that ankh near one of the other blocks. And when they touch, then you can move the hieroglyph block around the outside of the gray block, and you can use that to move that block to another location. And you can remove tiles from the board by connecting 2 like blocks together, as long as they're connected to other blocks in between. It's a bit difficult to explain. A video would definitely give you a better idea of what's going on, but it's a little bit like Shanghai, except that you can move the tiles around, and you still need like an open area. But once you get the hang of it, it's super, super fun. As we discuss some of the composers on the show, I'm going to take a very Amiga-centric look at their work. A lot of them started off on the C64, the ZX Spectrum, and probably went on to do PlayStation games and etc., etc. But I feel like, looking at these composers and focusing really hard on the Amiga this time, we'll just take a look at these games for a change. And Stember was quite prolific in the 4 years that he wrote music for games for the Amiga. He completed 40 games, so he did about 10 games a year. So that works out about 1 game a month for 10 years with a couple of months in between. So that's a lot of work. And for the quality of music that he put out, I think that's absolutely fantastic. He was making games between 1990, I'd say late 1989 until 94, so maybe closer to 5 years than 4 years, but still, 40 games in that time is quite a lot. The games that he worked on, you might not know too well because they don't sound very familiar to me. He did work on one called Mad TV, which was not related to the sketch comedy show that came 2 decades afterwards. Metal Law, a couple of games in the On the Ball series, which was a football/soccer game. the Amiga version of Mr. Nuts from Ocean, which had an SNES and I think maybe a Genesis release. BC Kid, which was the Amiga port of Bonk for the TurboGrafx 16. Realms of Arcania, which was a point-and-click adventure from US Gold. And Dungeons of Avalon and Dungeons of Avalon 2 both were dungeon crawlers. So, some decent stuff. You know, mostly these games have kind of either a medieval feel with like a point-and-click adventure. There are a couple of like action Turrican style games like Metal Law and The Oath that had more kind of like action dancey tunes, but for the most part his music seems to be a little bit more laid back and reverent, and this I think is a really good example of that music. Alright, let's move on to our next track. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Double Dragon 2. Well, the opening credits music to this game is really good, and it's considered by a lot of folks to be one of the most nostalgic and favorite pieces of music written for the system. This one was released in 1989, developed by Binary Design, and published by Virgin Mastertronic, and composed by Thomas Dahlgren, Steve Barrett, and Richard Applin. Alright, the opening credits theme from Double Dragon 2, released on the Amiga in 1999, composed by Tomas Dahlgren and Steve Barrett. I do believe that Richard Applin is also credited as composition. He was one of the two programmers of the game as well. Binary Design was a two-man team, Richard Applin and Gary Vine, so he might have been part of the, programming sound effects and stuff. I do think that Tomas Dahlgren and Steve Barrett were the two main composers on board. Some people call this a cover or, an Amiga conversion of the title theme to the arcade game. I've listened to them both and I don't hear too much similarity. Maybe there's something that I'm not picking up in in my ears, or it's just too dancified and spiced up to be recognizable. Anyways, I really love this tune. It's a great jam, it's super dancey, there's some great solos going on there, some fun, orchestra stabs here and there. And it's great to listen to while you're, playing the game too, because the way the game starts up is, the title screen comes on, and then there's a couple of text scrollers that happen. One that's got, the copyright information for the game that scrolls up the screen, and then the credits for the game scrolls up the screen, and then afterwards you get the full kind of story of Double Dragon 2 and how Jimmy and Bimmy have to go and avenge Marion, who's been murdered this time by the bad guys. So there's stuff to do while you're listening to the music, and that's nice. A lot of, Amiga, Commodore 64 games would just kind of sit on a static screen while you're listening to this, epic 8-minute long track. And while the tune is usually a jam, your eyes might get a little bit bored. Anyways, this is this is a divisive game among people. I read a lot of reviews that say, oh, this is a fantastic arcade conversion, the sound effects are great, it plays great, this is one of the best arcade to Amiga ports that's, on the system, so glad I bought this back in the day. And then there are others who are like, oh, this is unplayable, this is mediocre, I don't like it at all. So, I don't know, I played it myself, and it's definitely playable. Having played the arcade version of Double Dragon, the NES version of Double Dragon, I find this to be somewhere in the middle. I was not really a big fan of the NES, any of the NES Double Dragons for that matter. I think this is better than the NES version, especially in terms of sound effects, graphics. It just seems to play better all around. So I'm gonna go ahead and call this a good game, and probably worth checking out if you like beat 'em ups, and especially classic ones. Coupled with the music, I think you're gonna have a good time on your hands if you check out Double Dragon 2: The Revenge on the Amiga. As far as the composers go, Tomas Dahlgren was, kind of a freelancer. He worked on games for a whole bunch of different companies, and inclusion of Double Dragon 2, Fuzzball for System 3, Mr. Tengus Adventure for Amiga Fun, Zarathustra for Hewson, and Zeriax for the software business. And those were all between 1989 and 1991. Steve Barrett, also a limited number of titles to his name, and inclusion to Double Dragon 2, The Chronicles of Omega for Arc Developments, Artificial Dreams for Prism Leisure, Advanced Ski Simulator for Codemasters. You guys should know all about Codemasters if you are a VGMbassy listener. Dragonscape from Free Spirit Software, Kelly X from Virgin Games, and a conversion of the board game Monopoly by Leisure Genius, which came out in 1989. So, a couple of fun titles down. We got a really funky track coming up. This is one of my favorites from the show. This one is called Mean Arenas. It was released in 1993. We're going to listen to a track called Orchestra Rock, and this was composed by a collective known as Digital Masters. Alright, that was Orchestra Rock from Mean Arenas, released on the Amiga in 1993, composed by Digital Masters. Mean Arenas was developed by Nighttime Games and published by ICE. Paul Atkinson was the singular coder and sound effect man for this game, so it was one person on the graphics, Alex Kewen, and Paul Atkinson handling everything else. This song's got an interesting history. It's a great tune. You know, it's got a nice beat to it. It's got some funky kind of horn stabs. Very traditional kind of Amiga demo scene style. Arpeggiated keyboard, dun 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 dun. Like you hear that in a lot of the demo scene stuff. Great driving beat, a couple of different parts to kind of bring you up and down in mood. Really good stuff. So this was released in 93. In 1991, there was a tune called Gummy Snoppus, released by demo scener Tip for the Amiga. And that song sounds almost identical to this one, except it's slightly extended with a little bit of a keyboard solo in the middle of it. So I don't know if Tip is actually Digital Masters. I mean, it would make sense that maybe he just adapted his song to the Mean Arenas game. The Digital Masters moniker was not used in any other game that I can see, Amiga or otherwise. So it's possible that it was a one-off demo scener, just adapting some music. But the very prolific composer, demo scener, chiptuner by the name of El Mobo, aka Moby, has a song called Progressive Funk, which is 11 minutes long, and that contains elements of this tune as well. That tune, it sounds like it was created later on. It doesn't sound like a 4-channel mod file. It sounds maybe more like a 16 or a 20-channel extended mod file. So it might be that he was influenced by this tune and created his own stuff based on it later on. It could be that Tip is Digital Masters and is also El Mobo. So there's a trio of 3 songs that all kind of have a very similar melody to them, and it's very kind of murky as to who was the original, who's the actual composer, if they're all the same person. Anyways, if you guys are interested, I can add links to the other 2 versions of this song so you guys can kind of compare and contrast. But as it is, I mean, this song is great. From the first time I heard it, I was totally hooked on it, and it's been stuck in my head for a long time, especially that funky horn stab section. I really, really like that. This was another game where there's basically just music on the title screen and like the name entry screen, but the game itself is sound effect only. I guess it kind of makes sense because the sound effects in this game are pretty advanced for the time. They're fairly long, real-world samples. There's a lot of voice, so the game is kind of similar in like theme to Smash TV, where there's a pair of announcers and the protagonist that you're playing as is in a game show arena, and there are mines and fire pits, and like you're basically fighting for your life to win cash and prizes, just like on Smash TV. This one is more of a labyrinth-based game, though, instead of like a twin-stick shooter. So what you're doing is going through these mazes, and some of them almost seem Pac-Man-like because there's a lot of gold coins you can pick up, but they're all scattered like Pac-Man dots around these screens. And you just have to basically run around, pick them up, avoid the mines, avoid the fire, avoid the enemies that are running around, and get out before time runs out or you die. There are a lot of floppy disk icons with the letter M on them all over the screen, and every time you pick them up there's a new message, and the message would be like a quick little sentence or two just saying, oh, you better watch out, you need to have good timing, like little hints about how to get through the rest of the level. But they are everywhere. and they are sometimes impossible to avoid. There'll be like a very narrow hallway, and the icon to pick up the message takes up the entire hallway, and so you have to stop and read the message and then keep moving on. I can imagine that after playing this game over and over again, if you owned it and were trying to get good at it, that these messages would get really, really grating after a while. I was watching one level, and there was a total of 23 different messages that you have to pick up and read as you're going through these 5 or 6 screens to get to the end. It's a little overkill on the dialogue, but doesn't mean that the game's not fun, and the music is great. So all in all, I think it's worth checking out. This was also available on the CD32. I don't know if there's a different set of music for it. Sometimes for CD32 games, you would have a Redbook audio soundtrack that would either be a enhanced version of the original mod files or an entirely original set of music. But I haven't been able to find any CD32 digital audio tracks for this game, so I'm assuming that the CD32 version also played this music as well. Okay, time to move on to a 1994 game called Clockwiser. This is another puzzler. This was developed by Team Hoy and published by Rasputin. The composer is Raymond Bramuller, and we're going to be listening to a track called In Game 3. Oh, a much more laid-back track than what we've been hearing at the beginning of this show. That was In Game 3 from Clockwiser, released on the Amiga in 1994, composed by Ramon Bramuller. Again, this was developed by Team Hoy and published by Rasputin. I like this one because, like I said, it was different than a lot of the other tracks that we're going to be featuring on this show, but it also was just so friggin' smooth. I could probably sit around and play puzzle games to this all day and not really get tired of it. Not too much to say about it. I like the selection of tones. I like the bass line. It did give me kind of like Super Adventure Island, but maybe a little more chill vibes, or like a chilled out Bomberman track. I don't know, something from that kind of era of the Super Nintendo. It feels good, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's a demo version of this game out too that only has like a limited amount of levels in it, and it includes an entirely different set of music, which I thought was pretty interesting. That version seems to be really easy to find, but the full soundtrack to the full game I had to really kind of hunt down, and I'm glad I did, because it's got some really good music on it. Ramon Bremuller was a member of Team Hoi, H-O-I, and they are called Team Hoi because their first game was called Hoi, which I thought was kind of cool, which was an adventure game featuring a little green dinosaur with no arms and only feet. I thought that was fun. Ramon also worked on Cognition, which came out in 1993, Venom Wing, a shmup, which was released in 1990, and a AGA remix of Hoi, which came out the year after the original version did. AGA stands for Advanced Graphics Accelerator, which was kind of like a equivalent to like a NVIDIA card nowadays for the Amiga. It was still 2D graphics, but they were just a little bit more powerful, more colors on the screen, faster processing, etc., etc. So this game is interesting because, what's the best way to explain this? The screen is split in half. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a series of blocks in a pattern. They're different colors, they're lined up in a certain way. On the left side of the screen, which is the screen that you control, you see the same number and color of blocks, but they are all astray, different pattern, random places on the screen, etc., etc. And it's called Clockwiser because what you do is you draw a four-sided shape on the screen, a square or a rectangle, kind of highlight certain amounts of blocks, and then at the bottom of the screen there's a clock with a left arrow and a clock with a right arrow, and you rotate what you've highlighted and the size of the block that you've highlighted. So you use that to try to match the pattern on the left side with the template on the right side. It kind of feels like it's a mix between a sliding tile puzzle and a Rubik's Cube, both of which I absolutely despise, so I did not have fun with this game at all when I tried playing it. I am notoriously awful at sliding puzzles. I just can't figure out how to do them. I don't know if it's just something broken in my brain, but I have spent hours in video games with stupid sliding puzzles that are only like, 9 tiles big, trying to figure out how to complete the picture. So as soon as I kind of saw that, I was like, I'm not going to be playing this for very much. And like I said, the music was good. I think the music was what kept me playing for the longest amount of time, but nope. Not the game for me. If you like sliding puzzles and Rubik's Cubes and stuff, hey, this might be a game to check out. And not only was it on the Amiga, it was also on DOS. So if you have an old computer or, you use the DOS box emulator, you might find it easier to try this one out in DOS than digging up an Amiga emulator or using a real console or something like that. Anyways, thought it was a lot of fun. Wanted to throw it in the show because it's, like I said, a bit of a unique tune in terms of what we're listening today. Time to kick back into some more energetic stuff. I'm going to listen to the title screen music from a game called Cyberblast. This was designed and published by Enterprise in 1990, and this was composed by Ron Claren. Andreas Hummel also worked on this game. He wrote the intro tune, but this is the title screen music. Alright, there we go, the title screen from Cyberblast, released on the Amiga in 1990. This tune composed by Ron Claren. Andreas C. Hummel, like I said before, wrote the intro music as a little introductory cinematic before the game starts. He wrote the music for that. He also designed and coded the game with production and graphics by Michael E. Basil. It's very easy to give credit to everybody that works on Amiga games because the teams are so incredibly small. It's funny. Anyhow, this game is a sci-fi version of Gauntlet, more or less. I'm pretty sure you all just pictured exactly what I'm talking about. The graphics are kind of, like alien biological. The walls are kind of like made up of like intestine-like material, and you've got laser beams, and you've got a spacesuit on, and the enemies are all kind of like spherical with wires coming out of them. And if you remember the Sega Master System game Xenophobia, it's very similar to that. Kind of gross, but kind of cartoony at the same time. Lots of mazes, lots of enemies to shoot. The tricky thing about this game is that when you shoot, you can also shoot your power-ups and remove them from the screen. So you have to really kind of pick your shots, and there are a lot of instances where they play on that, where you've got power-ups strewn around enemies, and, there's some stuff there that would really make the rest of the level easier if you had them, and if you shoot them, then, you're in trouble. So it's added challenge to the game instead of just running and gunning, which I appreciated a lot. The levels are also randomized. There's 64 levels to beat the game, but they don't always appear in the same order. The first level is always the same, but then they start randomizing starting with level 2. And the level themes will stay the same, like the background graphics will stay the same, but the level patterns will change among themselves. So it almost feels kind of like a roguelike game while you're playing it, which, obviously 1990 was well before those games really became a thing. So there's a lot more replayability because you can get a new kind of feast for your eyes every time you go in there. Another game where there's no background music, so you're just listening to basic sound effects and such as you're playing throughout the game. Most folks, in terms of reviews that I've seen, prefer the Amiga version of Gauntlet to this game. I think the game is here for the music. The title screen is really, really good. This reminds me of something that you might hear composed in Hively Tracker. So the Paula chip also had a feature which had some Commodore 64-like music composition tools. So in addition to the sample-based stuff, you can put it in a mode where it would sound more or less like the Commodore 64 SID chip. This really sounds like that mode, but I don't exactly think that it's actually that mode. I think they're just using samples that are very similar to the Commodore 64 sounds. I really like those ARPs and those chords that are kind of like front and center throughout the entire track. And the lead keyboard that kind of does those little solo-y things is also very, very similar to a Commodore 64. So, I don't know, I like the kind of throwback. Even though this was a very early Amiga game, it just feels like that they were kind of aping the Commodore 64 music with a bit more of an advanced style. I really like the Hively Tracker stuff. I think even though it feels like Commodore 64 music, it's got a stereo effect to it that the C64 didn't have originally, and it just feels, I don't know, a little more clean in its sound. So there's not a whole lot of Hively Tracker music out there, so when I hear it, or I hear something that kind of like apes the SID chip like this, but it's a little more advanced, I really appreciate it. I'm just really drawn to it. So that's why I like this track so much. That's why I put it in the show. Ron Claren was mostly a demo scener. He's from the Netherlands, and his handle was Master Blaster. He's got a ton of different demos and such to his name, starting as far back as 1988, mostly with Amiga stuff. He went on to become a game composer as well, but was still writing music for Amiga demos way up until 2011. One of his best-known soundtracks is that of Battle Squadron, which was released on the Amiga and later on the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis. Okie dokes. Moving on to the back half of the show. Here's a game I had never heard of before. It's called Projectile but with a Y. Projectyle. This was developed by Eldritch the Cat, published by Electronic Arts in 1990. The music was composed by Steve Wetherill, and the track we're going to listen to is called Manic Moose. Manic Moose from Projectyle, released on the Amiga in 1990, published by Electronic Arts, composed by Steve Wetherill. Really good tune. I really like this one. It's got some meat on its bones. It's nice and long. It feels kind of like a surf rock kind of a jam. I like the interlude with the claps, and it's sunshiny. Like, you can't listen to this and not start to feel like real good about everything. So I like listening to this when I'm in the car, especially like spring, summertime. Just drop the windows, kind of blast it out, and drive around, have some fun. Especially like in the car with a really wide stereo panning, Amiga music sounds really cool because you've got like music coming from the passenger side and music on your driver's side, and they're kind of blending together, and it just feels really harmonious. It makes your car feel bigger for some reason. Wide stereo panning, I guess, has that mental effect on you. There's no music that plays during gameplay, of course, as with most Amiga games, and that's mostly because of just the limited amount of sound channels. You know, it's really hard to make a good Amiga track in less than 4 channels, and you're obviously going to need at least 1 or 2 of those channels for sound effects. And it's not like the NES where you can assign priorities to sound effects and just have that channel drop out to play the sound effect. The Amiga can't really do that. It's either going to be dedicated to that song or it's going to be dedicated to a sound effect. This game has a ton of sound effects. This game plays like a cross between hockey and air hockey, I guess is the best way to... There's like 3 teams on this big giant board, and you get a puck, and your players are just circles that you move around, and you try to get the puck into your own colored goal. But the levels are huge, and they're like giant squares that are bigger than the size of the screen, but then those squares are connected to other squares by these narrow tunnels, and you can't move your player into those tunnels, but once the puck goes into the tunnel, it pops out in another square, and there's another set of 3 players there that are kind of all vying for the puck to get it into another tunnel. And eventually you have to make your way through like this entire map to get to the opposing team's goal. And then once you're there, there's a goalie and you have to try to, get it past the goalie to make a point. So as you might imagine, the games are low scoring games because it takes quite a while to get anywhere. But graphics are cool. There's cool power-ups. All of the teams have like really well-designed logos, and the little circles that you control look very, very different depending on which team you are. So the graphic design is really, really good in this game. I think it matches the quality of the music quite nicely. I played one game of it just to try to figure it out, and it was in this lava level, and there was like bubbles coming up from the lava all around me, and everything was kind of like, red and brownish, and it just felt hot. Like, it just did a really good job at the atmosphere for this game. The developer is called the Eldritch Cats, and so I decided that would be my team. Maybe they're a little more powerful than the other ones. So my little circle was a yellow circle with a black cat on it, and then there were a couple of other enemy players, and one looked like a tank, and the other one had like a green kind of a vector arrow on it, and they were called the Vectors. So it was cool. It was fun to play. I feel like it would be great multiplayer. I haven't played it local multiplayer, and I'm wondering how that would work. I guess you would just take control of whichever players were on that particular block that you were in, because there is only one puck, so you would just switch at the same time, and you'd always be kind of opposing each other depending on which tunnel you went through. So, game gets good reviews. People just say it's very, very intense, and you are like nearly physically exhausted once you've finished a game, because they do go on for a while, and it is constant action all the way through. Steve Wetherill worked for System 3 and Electronic Arts. Projectile in 1990 was his first game. After that, he went on to make Myth, History in the Making, did the music for that. That was developed by System 3. And then 2 years after that, in 1994, the CD32 version of Myth came out. He also did the streaming audio for that. And then Desert Strike Return to the Gulf in 1993. That obviously made its way over to the States on both the SNES and the Genesis. I believe he wrote the music for those as well. So kind of breaking out of the Amiga there. Cool game. Check it out. I really think, even if you looked at some video of it online, you'd be kind of intrigued by how it plays. And it does feel like it would be a really cool multiplayer game. Okay, let's move on to a game called George Glaxo. This one was released in 1992. It was composed by Jesper Olsen. And again, we're going to listen to the title screen music from the game. Yeah, that was the title screen music from George Glaxo, released on the Amiga in 1992, composed by Jesper Olsen. You guys all know I'm a sucker for chip rock, especially, being a huge fan of Matt Furnace, Tim Follin, etc. So this really hits the spot, especially that lead instrument's kind of like a cross between a distorted guitar and harmonica. It just feels really, really cool. And it's just got this really nice bluesy feel. I really, really dig this one. It really stuck out when I was kind of like looking for new tunes to play for this show. The rest of the soundtrack's very much like this as well. I just like I like the title screen music the most because it's got the deepest, hardest groove to it. It gets me bobbing my head quite a bit. And, it's an interesting genre for a game that was entirely made in Denmark. Usually the European games have more of a dancey Eurobeat feel, and to have a really kind of quintessential American bluesy soundtrack was a bold choice. I felt like maybe the developers thought that they could experiment a little bit more because this wasn't really a retail game. The Glaxo in George Glaxo is from GlaxoSmithKline, the pharmaceutical company, and this is a game that is... I guess it's kind of it's produced in association with asthma medicine, and George is an asthmatic, and he needs to take his inhaler at the beginning and the end of every stage. And I guess it's to get kids to get more in the habit of taking their inhaler as prescribed. I'm not really sure. In between levels, though, George runs from left to right as a platformer, carrying either a crossbow or a shotgun, and just murdering wildlife, like birds, ducks, dogs. They're all very friendly looking. They're just running around, and you are just shooting your way through these levels. And you're a cartoony character yourself. You look a little bit like John Arbuckle from the Garfield comic strips. And it's kind of weird. I really encourage you to look at some video for this game. I don't know. The graphics are great. The levels are all differently themed, and in each level, George is dressed in like different appropriate attire. He's in a bathing suit for the beach level. He's all bundled up for the snow level. He's got, like a plaid shirt on for the forest level. So it's really well done. The visuals are great, but it's like there's not much story to it. Whatever it is, like it's all in Dutch. Like I can't understand any of the dialogue or anything. Not that there's much to begin with. It's like, why are you like murdering these dogs and these birds? Like, I don't. And then taking your inhaler. Like, all this senseless murder is making me short of breath. I don't know, man. The 90s were wild. Anyways, it is a fun game though. I mean, as a platformer, it's a really smooth, kind of well-made game, and kind of blows a lot of the other retail platformers on the system out of the water. So take a look at this one. It's definitely a laugh. And some of the comments, there's one review on Lemon Amiga that I thought was funny, and I'll read it before we move on to the next game. It's a 5 out of 10 star review, left in 2018, and Retrovirus, the commenter, says, crazy-eyed George Glaxo picks up a rifle and goes on a killing spree through Denmark. In between shooting puppies and anthropomorphic mice wearing sunglasses, he takes out an inhaler and pumps more hallucinogenic drugs into his system, further fueling his rampage. And that pretty much sums it all up. Poor George, or poor animals that come across George's path, anyway. Jesper Olsen has released a few games. There's actually one called Harold Hartend Kampen om die Renatender. It's Dutch. I probably murdered that pronunciation. That was a promotional game for Colgate-Palmolive, and it was about brushing your teeth. I don't want to know what kind of murder went on in that kind of game. There was a couple of train-based games, Goldkorn Expressen and Kalles Puffs Expressen, released by Supersoft in 1991, train-based puzzle games, and then a platformer called Lollipop, released in 1995 by Soft Gold. So, 5 Amiga games to his name, 2 of which were kind of based on the same train engine, as it were. Yuck, yuck. All right, let's move on. A couple more songs left. This one actually is a pretty popular Amiga tune. I'm sure it's been played on other podcasts before, at least the ones that, focus a little bit on Amiga. But I love it so much I had to play it just in case you haven't heard it. This is the in-game one music from Hybris, composed by Paul Vandervalk. Be right back. Okay, that was In Game 1 from Hybris, released in 1989 via Discovery Software, composed by Paul van der Valk. This is a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, and holy cow, for that 1989 game, this music is absolutely incredible. You get a lot of note and pitch bends that a lot of the other Amiga composers just either didn't know how to do or didn't want to deal with, because it's not very easy to do when you're composing for mods. But that wailing keyboard, it just gets me every time. Like, it sounds so emotive, and the solo is just, it feels so performed. It's not quantized like most sample-based music is. Really, really good use of the arpeggios underneath it all, and you got your kind of basic rolling drum plus bass underneath that. This song, I think, became kind of a template for a lot of demo scene music that came after it. Every comment I see, whether it's from an Amiga site or on YouTube, points out how ahead of its time this soundtrack was. Paul van der Valk really knocked it out of the park. Unfortunately, he didn't really do too much else on the Amiga, and he did end up passing away a couple years ago in August of 2021. In 1997, a few years after Hybris was released, he also released a couple of, I guess, kind of homebrew coded games called Poing, that were coded and composed by him as well, and included some amazing music with kind of simple gameplay. It was kind of almost like a soundtrack delivery game, more or less. But I think there were like 6 or 7 of them. Yeah, there was Poing 1 through 7, released between 1992 and 2002. He released almost one a year, which I thought was really cool. They're kind of like Breakout clones. But yeah, Hybris is a competent vertically scrolling shooter. The Amiga couldn't push too many sprites at once, and this one had a bunch of activity going on the screen and still remained pretty smooth. Ship had lots of power-ups, fun to play. Of course, with a soundtrack like this going in the background, it's going to enhance the experience of any game out there. But rest in peace, Paul. Your legacy is definitely much appreciated, especially among Amiga music fans. A couple more tracks left for the show. Next one is the intro theme from Mysterious Worlds. This one's composed by Charles Deenan, who is right up there with like Rudolph Stember and Paul van der Valk in terms of names that are much more well known in Europe than they are in the US. So let's listen to the intro theme, and we'll be right back. Alright, the intro theme from Mysterious Worlds released on the Amiga as part of an Amiga Fun cover disc in 1990, composed by Charles Deanan of Maniacs of Noise. Again, I'm sure you folks are familiar with Maniacs of Noise from my Break Quest episode, in which I mostly shared music by Drax, aka Thomas Mogensen, and I think there was a Charles Deanan track thrown in there, as well as a couple of Euro and Tell tracks too. But I heard this one and I could not put it down, even though I wanted to share mostly unknown composers. I just love the percussion in this, and I love that it has kind of a Middle Eastern flair, but then gets kind of rock, and then it has kind of a nice piano interlude in the middle, and then rolls back into that really aggressive bass and drum line. I wouldn't expect anything less than amazing from anybody in Maniacs of Noise. They're kind of like the premier Amiga composition group as far as, old school games go. So this one did not disappoint me at all. The same cannot be said for the game. Again, like I said, this was released as part of a disc that came with a magazine called Amiga Fun. And it was a little bit different in Europe than it was in the US. When official PlayStation magazine came out, you would get demos of the PlayStation games on a CD that was packed with the magazine. Amiga Fun and a couple of the other Amiga mags over in Europe would give you full games, and then generally weren't, AAA retail games or very long games. But sometimes you'd get a gem, and unfortunately Mysterious Worlds was not that much of a gem. The graphics are good. It kind of reminds me a lot of Lemmings visually, except it plays like a platformer. So you're a dude, like a shirtless, long-haired dude about the size of a lemming on the screen, and running from left to right through caves, medieval landscapes, etc., collecting power-ups, and, fighting off dragons and lava beasts, etc., etc. But it was buggy, very difficult to control, and had some real soft locks built into it, where if you collected some items that you needed to complete the stage and then died, you would lose the item, but it would not reappear back on the stage. So you were essentially like dead in the water. You needed to reset and start playing again. So, probably rushed out to get on whatever month's disc that was, but fortunately a couple of good Amiga tunes from Deanan came out of it, and again, like most of the reviewers, kind of agree with that sentiment, that when they were kids, they would boot up this game not to play the actual game, but just to listen to the really cool music from Charles Deanan. Okay, moving on to our last tune. Get out your glow sticks. This is a pretty dancey soundtrack, and it's a huge soundtrack. It's a longer tune too, which is kind of why I left it for the end. This is from a game called Kid Chaos, and the music is from The Labyrinth, aka The Toxic Wasteland, Stage 2-3. This was composed by a duo called Pipe Smoker's Cough, aka Daniel Davies and Rob Fenn. Enjoy. Alright, that was Stage 2-3, The Labyrinth, aka Toxic Wasteland, from Kid Chaos, released on the Amiga in 1994, composed by a duo known as Pipe Smoker's Cough, aka Daniel Davies and Rob Fenn. Haven't been able to find out anything about Pipe Smoker's Cough. This is the only instance in which I can find that name and or either of those two composer names, Daniel Davies and Rob Fenn, together. They are fairly common names too, so Google searching the individual names comes up with thousands of results, none of which really point me in the direction of anything music composition-wise. So can't speak too much on that. However, the music is really good, and there is a ton of it in this game. Each world has 4 different sub-levels, like obviously this one is Stage 2-3, so every Stage 2 theme is kind of a variation on that level's theme. So Stage 2-2 and 2-1 will have music that sounds similar to this, but slightly different. I don't know, I just like this one the best out of all of them. The Stage 3 music is like a construction zone, and it has a really industrial feel to it, but it's kind of long, and we just did a whole bunch of industrial last episode, so I figured we'd do something maybe a little more dancey and traditionally video gamey from Kid Chaos for this one. But good soundtrack, definitely go listen to it all. I think you'll get a good hour's worth of fun dance music out of it. The game itself is crazy. It's a Sonic clone. It's a Sonic the Hedgehog clone. Everything from, like, the backgrounds are definitely inspired by the Sonic levels. It's got the line scrolling, like, green field in the background. Originally, the character of Kid Chaos, who's kind of a caveman-y, looks kind of like a cartoon bully. He's got a red jacket and jeans, but he's got a big jaw, and he kind of looks like he's slumped over, kind of like a caveman. Originally, he was going to be an anthropomorphic animal, either a rabbit or a mouse or something, but Magnetic Fields, who developed the game, thought that that might be a little bit too close to Sonic the Hedgehog, and they didn't want to get sued by Sega, so they ended up going with this caveman kid instead. And when he jumps, he rolls into a ball just like Sonic does, but he's got this giant club that kind of sticks out and kind of twirls around along with him. But he, runs up and down hills, spins around, jumps on enemies the same way. It's basically like playing Sonic the Hedgehog on your Amiga. I had no idea this existed, and the game is really, really good. Like, it's smooth as heck, super fast. The levels are really cool. Even when you go into caves, when you break open walls and go inside the stone cave areas and the levels, your character gets shaded, like there's no sunlight on them anymore, and then they brighten back up when they go back out into the world under the blue sky. There's lots of really cool details that they put into this one. Evidently, there were a few Sonic the Hedgehog clones released for the Amiga, but this one is said to be the best of them, and I can absolutely see why. This just looks and plays like a dream. I had a lot of fun playing it. I played just the first couple levels to figure out what was going on, and I think I want to go back and play the whole game through, because it's fun. It's a little more simple than Sonic, but it's got the charm, I think, and that's really what matters the most. Plus, the music is just really cool to listen to as well. Can't talk too much about the pedigree of the composers, of course, but I can say that Magnetic Fields as a developer was also responsible for making the Lotus games, which are widely regarded as some of the best games on the Amiga ever, including some amazing soundtracks from Barry Leach as well, so there's quite the pedigree there. Alright friends, that pretty much wraps up our Amiga music. I had a lot of fun checking out some games that I normally wouldn't have played, and had a lot of fun playing them. I hope that you guys found some new cool music, maybe some new cool composers that you want to check out. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear if you want to see more of these games or listen to more Amiga music, because I have access to pretty much the entire Amiga library at this point, and several different ways to play them, whether it's on my Mister, or whether it's emulating them on a computer, even on my Raspberry Pi, so I can experience the Amiga and bring some of the best music to you guys, and share some more of it. As far as upcoming episodes go, I do have a few in the works with some guests. Not sure what order they're going to be in or which months they're going to be on, but they will be soon. A couple different cool themes coming up. As always, our secondary show of each month will be Embassy exclusive, in which I get together with Joe and Todd, and that's the end of every month. So this show will be releasing at the beginning of April, and at the end of April you'll hear from Embassy exclusive. You can always find us on Twitter at the VGMbassy, or you can head over to thevgmbassy.com and check out all of our releases, all of our track lists from all of our previous shows, as well as listen and download MP3s of our podcasts. If you want to listen to them on the go and don't have internet for whatever reason, yeah, you can download the MP3s there. You can also find the link to our Discord, and the VGMbassy Discord is always active. I'm on Discord 24/7, practically. You'll find a lot of friends of the show there, sharing our thoughts and feelings about video game music, life, gaming in general. It's a really cool hangout full of lots of really cool folks. And you can also visit patreon.com/thevgmbassy if you'd like to help contribute financially to the costs accrued by hosting this show and keeping up with the latest and greatest recording and producing equipment, etc. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank all of my patrons at the end of every show, starting with our Taurus level, Cameron Childs and the Phantomeyer, our VG Emissary tier, Chris Murray, Chris Myers, Gannon11, Keyglyph, Kyle Kroll, The Dyad, Daryl Bowers, The Last Recon, and Thomas Hunt. Our audio attaché members, Cameron Worma, Carlos from the Heroes 3 podcast, and Scott McElhone. And our special agent tier, Ryan Steele. Thank you guys so much for contributing to the show, and look forward to more patron-only goodies coming up in the next couple of months. As always, I'd like to thank Indira J for the podcast art, and Trevin Hughes, aka Dread, for the amazing podcast theme song. We are slowly careening towards episode 100, and I promise there will be some very good anniversary goodies for y'all on that amazing milestone. All right, so we'll see you guys at the end of the month with Embassy exclusive, and then back again in 1 month for another VG Embassy. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and keep listening to Awesome VGM.